Okay, great. So just first to clarify that the report has an English summary on page 25, and as I said, this webinar will also be made available on our YouTube page together with some Swedish content. Just first to explain what an inquiry commission is. Basically, in Sweden, when the government wants to change some legislation, it's a common practice to deploy an inquiry commission. And in doing so, the commission is semi-autonomous. So we are given directives that you see to the right here that are decided by the government, but then the commission will do its work independently from the government. And once finalized, the commission will present its report to the government. And our task has been to develop a new legal framework for planning and permitting for offshore wind. And it has specifically been addressed in our directives that we should consider a transition to a tender-based system, and also to consider the ongoing projects that we will soon delve into, that we have a lot of in Sweden. It's important to state that there are a number of very relevant questions relating to offshore wind that is not included in our task, and 3 of them are the application of the system. So, for example, where and when offshore wind parks should be developed or permitted is not part of our scope. Neither is what role offshore wind should have in Swedish energy policy. For example, what capacity targets we should have, or and so. And further, questions relating to governmental market interventions, such as contracts for difference or similar measures from the government, like providing offshore grid in the ocean, that is not part of the commission scope either. So it's really just the framework for planning and permitting. And so on Friday, we delivered our report, and here you see the chair of the committee, Mr. Magnus Hermansson, to the right, and Sweden's Minister of Climate and Environment, Ms. Romina Pourmokhtari, at the press conference where we delivered our report. And just to start off by sort of explaining for an international audience where we are in Sweden. So to the left here, you will see a map of ongoing projects. And when you sort them out in different categories in the chart to the right, you will see that there are in total about 75 projects in Sweden. There are 4 offshore wind parks that are operational. There are another 4 that have been approved, permits. And then there's a large number of projects that have applied for a permit, commenced a pre-permit process, or applied for a subsea exploration permit. And then there are also additional projects that are in an even earlier phase. And then there are about 15 projects that have been denied permits recently. And basically, just to explain what you're looking at, Sweden does not have any binding planning for offshore wind. And we actually don't have any legislation that pertains to offshore wind either. We simply, as of now, apply general legislation for permitting under the environmental code and the economic exclusive zone. And these legislations, they allow for permits for offshore wind and other applications of the sea to be permitted. And basically, this means that a developer is allowed under the legislation to apply for a permit anywhere in the sea, and that permit will then be processed. And the final decision on whether that permit should be allowed and whether that area should be developed is made as part of the permitting process at the end of the whole process. So that's how the Swedish system works. And as you can see, this has resulted in a very large number of applications being submitted over the last few years. For many of you who come from more developed legislative frameworks, you would kind of probably think, what's going on up there? Why do they have this chaotic system? But it's really, I think, just to understand, you need to understand that Sweden has never really developed any exploration of the sea. We don't have any history of gas or oil or anything like that. So we've never had a reason to develop legislation for infrastructure and such applications in the ocean. And for many years, it was also not considered a viable application to have large-scale offshore wind in Sweden. The technology prices were way too high. And since we have a very low electricity price in Sweden relative to the rest of Europe, there was a large funding or profitability gap. But then things changed very rapidly around the 2020. Basically, the technology prices came down very rapidly, as many of you know. And at the same time, the Swedish industry started making very extensive plans on electrification, which meant that there was a projected surge in electricity coming over the coming years. So Amanda, I think someone has unmuted, so if you could just see if that's possible to mute. So, and then came all of these, and at this, in a couple of years, the Swedish government realized that we need to do something about our system, and our commission was deployed. So if we, and also I need to add here that we don't have any subsidy schemes, contracts for difference, and we don't have any offshore grid provided by the government. So any project that is being developed will receive a permit and is then provided, or it's then necessary for the project to do a fully merchant development, finding offset for the electricity on the PPA market or on the spot market, and carry their own costs to do the grid connection and the seabed cabling. So if we just zoom in before we go on to the 3 or 4 actually most mature columns here, you will see that operational is actually almost nothing. And that's because the 4 parks that are operational are quite old at this time. They were developed around 2010. And they amount to about 400 megawatts together in total. And then you can see that the approved permits that we have are around 20 terawatt hours. That's the measure that we use in Sweden. For some reason, I know that the rest of Europe talks about gigawatts, but we talk about terawatt hours per year. That's around 20 that have been approved. And then there are hundreds of terawatt hours per year in potential production that are in the applied for permit or commenced pre-permit process columns. At the same time, it's important to remember that the current maritime spatial plans that were decided in 2020, they actually only point out a very limited number of areas. And even these are all combined with reservations pertaining to the defense interests and also in some cases to Nature 2000 areas. So these maritime spatial plans are currently being redeveloped, developed to allow for even more, but those plans have not been decided by the government yet. So this is the current standing as of maritime spatial planning for offshore wind. So basically to dive in directly into our proposal. So we suggest a tender-based system. And for those of you who are knowledgeable of the different systems around Europe, our system is technically or legally very similar to Denmark's, which means that we have a quite limited number of provisions in the law that will define how the tender-based system should work. But instead, most of the application is done in the actual tenders and in the licenses, in the concessions, in the concession agreements. So this means that we have opted for a system that is similar to Denmark's, but the application might differ. So as we can discuss, as I will discuss later, Denmark has chosen to have very detailed tenders with very strict timelines and organized grid connection. And you know, those of you who know that there are hundreds of pages. That could be the case in Sweden, but we could also opt for a much more lighter degree of detail in the licenses. So as As now, the maritime spatial plans and other plans, we have municipal physical planning, and we also have like grid development plans, and there are some other plans, but all of those are under the Swedish system only indicative. So they will not provide any binding planning. And this will be the case also going forward. They will be indicative for the tender-based system. And then what is new then is that we suggest that the government will be given the mandate to designate an area for offshore wind. And in our system, these are the only areas that will be allowed to be developed offshore wind. So there will be a prohibition against offshore wind in any area that has not been designated for offshore wind by the government. In these areas, the use of the area for energy production will have precedence over other uses. And that's actually also a new thing in the Swedish law, because under Swedish law, the decision on which usage that should have precedence is actually decided only at the end of the permitting normally. Everything before that is only indicative. But we suggest as a new methodology that this should be bindingly decided, that the usage for energy production will have precedence over, for example, fishery or sea trafficking or defense purposes. What we're also suggesting is a collaborative process where an authority will have the responsibility to prepare the government's decision, and in that work they will have to collaborate with whatever municipalities and other authorities that are involved. But we will not introduce an equivalence to the municipal veto that we have in Sweden today. And this is a politically very important, actually quite big question, because the question of the municipal veto for wind power is highly debated in Sweden and very important to many municipalities and municipal interests. But here we basically consider that shifting from like a permitting-based process to a planned-based process, where the government at the end of the day does the planning on how to use the sea, how to dispose of different interests, and how to find sufficient electricity production. It does not make any sense in our opinion to have a municipality able to veto that governmental decision. So once an area has been designated by the government, a concession or a license is for offshore wind shall be awarded to a developer, primarily through a public tender. And here, as I mentioned before, our system is very flexible, both in degree of detail and for the concession, and in terms of the criteria applied. So, for example, a tender could be, and a concession could both be Danish or British. And with British, I mean, from my understanding, where you would get from the Crown Estate a exclusivity for an area, but the contract with the Crown Estate will not have any detailed regulations on how the wind park should be developed, or when, and how it should be connected to the grid, and any adjustments that needs to be done to fisheries or defense interests. So you could go for that kind of tenders, or you could go Danish, so to say, where you add a lot of conditions to the concession. And this application will be part of the tendering authorities and the government's, of course, work once the tender-based system is implemented. Also, our proposal is that the system is flexible in terms of criteria applied. So the law says that it should primarily be done through a tender, and we have defined a tender as an auction where a monetary aspect or financial aspect is significant, but you can still have qualitative criteria, and there is also the possibility for the government to ad hoc in a designation decision say that an area should be awarded in another methodology, for example, like a strictly qualitative method. So as you start to understand, perhaps our suggestion is a framework which is to be implemented and applied as the system is starts to be applied. And then at the end, our suggestion is that a permit assessment will be done by the environmental court. So why do we suppose this transition from the current system? So basically, first of all, it solves 5 very distinct problems that we see with the current system. The first is that our suggestion will introduce adequate tools for planning. So the problems that we see today is that there is no real planning tool, as the maritime spatial plans are only indicative, and projects are being permitted outside of the designated areas, and projects are being denied permits within the designated areas in the maritime spatial plan. Here we introduce a tool for planning, which is the government designation of areas. And this means that you will not see what we've seen in several cases in Sweden, where a lot of work is being put into developing projects, and then having authorities handle these applications. And with each application of a project, you have several by applications, like for a grid concession, and you have Nature 2000, and then you have all kinds of different applications that are being developed. And then at the very end of that, the government will perhaps decide to deny a permit, and then all of this work will have been done for nothing. So here instead, the government will have to decide on beforehand if the area as such should be developed for offshore wind. And also this will allow for the government to have a better tool to address the cumulative effects of the development. In the current system, it's really technically, you will assess the impact of each park individually when you decide on that park, and that does not really allow for a overall planned approach on how the development in total will affect, like for example, defense or fisheries or environment for that sake. Also, the system introduces adequate tools for deciding which developer to award exclusivity, that's the auction, and also actually it introduces the possibility at all to obtain legal exclusivity. Our current framework does not allow for that, so it also introduces the possibility to coordinate the planning and permitting with the grid connection question. So today, these are done in completely different processes, which means that, for example, you can have 5 or 8 projects being developed and even permitted, even if that kind of amount hasn't happened yet in one area, but you could have several projects being permitted. And then you have a separate process with our transmission operator, Swedish Kraftnät, Svenska Kraftnät, on who to connect. And this coordination between the planning and the grid connection issue has caused a lot of issues here in Sweden under the current framework. But in our system, you can decide on beforehand that this designated area should be connected at this point, and whoever wins the concession will be guaranteed to be able to connect. And finally, the system introduces a tool to create clarity on whether permitted projects will be finalized or not. And this is actually a very big problem in Sweden right now, because since we only have a permitting process, there is no way of assuring that there is actually market conditions to finalize the projects that are being permitted. So we've had several projects that have been permitted since 2009, and none of them have actually been finalized in the end. And this is, of course, that since it's only a right to develop the project, it will make perfect sense for a developer to apply for a permit and think that, even if our calculus and business plan doesn't add up right now, perhaps in the future, costs will go down, or prices will go up, or perhaps something else will change, and eventually we will be able to make an investment decision. But as many of you know, in a auction-based or tender-based process, it's possible to assess the possibility the profitability even in the auction stage. As you saw in Denmark, you got an immediate feedback from the market that they rejected the possibility to develop offshore wind under those conditions. And I mean, I know that many people consider it a setback or in Denmark, but from a system perspective and compared to the Swedish system, it was actually very successful because we can see that from the auction point, you got the feedback that this will not be permitted. In Sweden, you would instead, this will not be finalized. In Sweden, you would rather have like permits given out, and then you would have to wait a number of years before you would realize that there's actually not these parks are actually not being developed. We have also realized that this kind of tender-based system is the completely dominating method in other countries. So we've made an outlook that considers these areas here you see on the map, and we have actually made a report where we've really looked into 4 of these countries. It's Denmark, Finland, Germany, and the UK. And this report is written in English. It was developed. And it has been submitted as an appendix to the report. So whoever wants to dive into the details of the different countries, here is our present Christmas gift to you. And when we look at the actual capacity that has been deployed during the last 10 years, between 2014 and 2023, we actually realized that it's everything more or less has been developed within tender-based systems. Here you see the gigawatts that have been deployed in this area that I showed you on the map, and it's only one park that we've been able to find at the west coast of Denmark that has been deployed under something else than the tender system. That was Denmark's open door system. Okay, so those are the reasons why we suggest this transition in Sweden, and the transition timeline is that we assess that a new legislation can be enforced by July 1st, 2026. And this is just assessing the kind of timeline that you would assume under Swedish procedure. And so up until then, you will see the legislation process, and then you will have the implementation that can be done in parallel with the relevant authority. And this means that the first tender can be initiated perhaps immediately during the fall of 2026, and the first concession could be awarded early 2027 in an ideal, timeline. And this means that whoever gains that concession will need to develop the project, and the first permit that has a legal force will be somewhere around 2029. And additional permits, then we are looking at 2030. And given the time that it takes to develop and deploy, you will look at the late 2030s before we are seeing deployed parks from the tender-based system. And this brings us to the question of ongoing projects and the 70 or even around 70 projects that I showed you earlier. So we suggest that these are being continued processed during the current regulatory scheme, which means that they will be allowed to apply for permit up until the day of the new legislation's entry into force. And after that, the door is closed. But the processing of these applications will continue until they have been processed. And this means that from these projects, we could see a deployment around 2030 already, because many of them are so mature at this point. And we also suggest a series of rule simplifications for these projects that will also be applicable in the tender-based systems. And this brings us to the question, like, okay, wait a second. I'm sure many of you are thinking, didn't he just say that the current system had all these flaws, and now he's saying that they're going to process all of these projects under the current system? How on earth is that going to work? Well, basically, our assessment is that the current legal framework in Sweden is actually quite generous as it comes to discretionary permitting from the government side. So our assessment is that the cost of denying all of the current projects their permits and starting over in the auction system, that will be, considering the demand for new electricity and the climate change urgency, that would be a sort of a suboptimal way of making use of the very many millions of kroners and even euros that have been deployed into all of these projects. And here our assessment is that it's very possible under Swedish law for the government to apply what we call a smorgasbord approach to the current projects, which means that you can actually, as long as you have good reasons that are non-discriminatory, you can sort of pick out the projects that you think are suitable as when it comes to developer and area, and you can even sort of change them. I mean, what do you say? Like use a scissors or a scalpel to kind of in the permitting change their layout if you need to, if, for example, in relation to defense purposes and radars and so on. So what we call this a planning by permitting approach, which is possible. I mean, it's not ideal and it's not a good system, but where we are now, it's the best thing to do with the ongoing projects. And this really allows us to solve most of the problems that I explained with the current system, except for one. And that is the clarity on finalization. And this constitutes really the main challenge when it comes to the ongoing projects. As I explained, we have given out a series of permits during the last few years, and none of them have been finalized. And this might be the case going forward. I will delve into that in a minute. But here we simply have to accept that the planning and permitting system does not provide for clarity on this question. We are giving out permits. We do not know from the permitting process whether the developer considers that the project will be developed, and we do not have any means of enforcing, like a mandating that the permit should be finalized. If we want to apply those kind of systems, we can do that, but it has to come as a separate system, set apart from the planning and permitting system. And here we say that, I mean, it's perfectly possible to have that kind of system. The UK has stands as a role model here, say where they have the contracts for difference scheme that is completely separate from the planning and permitting and seabed lease processes. So it's possible to add these kind of systems on top or by this on the side of the planning and permitting system. So to finally just say a few words about the consequences of our proposal. So basically, we consider that the main purpose that we were tasked to do is achieved. We provide for a more adequate system for planning and permitting. One of a big consequence is that the developer market in Sweden will have a structural change, changing from the current explorative, developer-driven, high-risk role that they have into a more traditional European role, where they will, of course, be an important talking partner to the authorities on what areas that are commercially viable and should be designated. But then they are bidders in the tender, and once they have received the concession, they become a developer under a very clear framework where there are hopefully not that many surprises going forward. But an important assessment on our side is that the transition in itself will not lead to an expanded development. And this is because our assessment is that there is, under current preconditions, not the market preconditions to develop offshore wind in Sweden, at least mainly. There might be exceptions, but I will get into that in a minute. So basically, when we started looking out in the outlook area, we realized that among the deployed offshore wind, there is more or less everything has been deployed under contracts for difference or some kind of grid connection, as we see it from a Swedish perspective. I know that the Germans and the Dutch doesn't necessarily see it as a subsidy, but from a Swedish perspective, where the developer is obliged to build the offshore grid connection, it's a kind of a subsidy. So everything has been built as you see, more or less like that. We've only found 2 parks constituting 0.5% of the deployed offshore wind capacity over the last 10 years that have been deployed pure merchant, where the developer does not have any CFD nor a grid connection subsidy. And look, when we realized this, that it looked like this, and at the same time that the Swedish electricity prices are actually much lower than they are in the countries that have applied these instruments, we realized that, wait, why should we expect any development to happen in Sweden when we have an even potentially worse market conditions for new deployment of offshore wind? So from that big question mark, we asked Sweco, a Swedish consultancy, to make an indicative analysis of the commercial preconditions for offshore wind. And their conclusion, it's an appendix to the report, is the map to the right here, where they have made a heat map of missing money in the different areas around the Swedish waters. And in this map, the dark blue areas is the assessment that the area misses around, I think it's 8 euros per megawatt hours. So the discounted revenues are 8 euros less than the discounted costs. And of course, here you will have a quite high cost of capital, since the whole price risk for like 30 years of volatile electricity prices lies with the project and with the investors. So this is our main reason that I just explained, these and the outlook, why we assess that permitting and a tender-based system in itself will not lead to a development of offshore wind. Now, there might be areas that are actually exceptions to this assessment, for example, that are close to the coast in the southern Sweden, especially if you don't have that much offshore wind built, so you have a higher capture rate for those that are built. But this is like the overall indicative assessment. And here we have not assessed any individual parks. We've just made this overall kind of assessment. And we've also asked PA Consulting, another consultancy, to make a peer review of Sweco's assessment. And they have found that on an overall level, their Sweco's assessments and methodology is acceptable, and they concur in the main conclusion. Right, so that was actually my presentation. I'm going to try to close now my screen sharing here. Go back to the, now I'm back here in the Teams meeting. Right. Very well. So I'm very happy to take your questions at this point. I think maybe if you can use the raise your hand. And then Amanda, I can just, we can see if it's me or Amanda. So please, Uti. And now it's mandatory to say who you are and what's your base, where do you come from, and what do you work with?
Okay, hello. Thank you for the presentation. It was interesting to hear of the results of your work. So my name is Outi Vilen. I'm from Finland, from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. And I have maybe one or two questions, but you mentioned that the ongoing projects are able to apply for the permit until 1st of July 26. And I was wondering what permit they should apply by that date, and what are the preconditions that they could apply for the permit. And I would also like to know whether you have assessed how many of these ongoing projects could be able to apply for the permit. Then.
Sure. I'm just going to, I saw that Jürgen asked here that yes, whether the recording will be made public. Yes, it will be made public on our YouTube channel. I can put the link in the chat immediately, so everyone has the address to the YouTube channel. Then I will answer your question. So in the territorial waters, it's a permit under the environmental code, and in the economic exclusive zone, it's a permit under the Swedish law for the economic exclusive zone. Those are the two permits that are being allowed to apply for. And then, of course, you're also allowed to apply for all the other permits that you need, but those are the two permits where the door will be closed on when the new law is implemented. And we have not made any assessment on how many projects that might be possible to provide permits. This is part of the implementation or application of the framework, and we only work with the actual framework.
Thank you.
So Jeppe?
Yes, hello. Jeppe Lundbæk from Denmark, but working for Total Energies. I wanted to ask you, I'm very familiar with the Danish offshore wind setup, and when you talk about being inspired by either the Danish or the British system, I would like to ask if you can tell more about the grid connection setup. The grid connection is very often a difficult step where you need to plan with the TSO, so you can be sure of getting rid of the electrons later. And it requires a lot of planning, at least for big wind farms. So it's important to know where you can grid connect the project. And that would probably go together with your tendering of sites, that you might have planned this already with the TSO. But can you say a little bit about how do you think about planning for the grid connection of these future wind farms?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is actually one of the key reasons that we suggest this transitioning, because under the current system, there is no possibility to make any kind of coordination between the planning, permitting of a site and a grid connection. But in our system, there is a possibility to make a coordination, meaning that the TSO or a regional grid company could make a clarification that we will provide this grid connection point, and that will of course be done in collaboration with the relevant tendering authority. And then it's part of the tender, or it's not technically part of the tender, but whoever wins the tender will be offered the grid connection. So that's a possibility in the system, but it's not mandatory. You could also have, you could also opt to have some areas tendered without that kind of grid connection coordination. This could, for example, be relevant when you're more coastal and you think that it makes more sense to just get all these like 5 or 6 sites out, get the developer working, and then have the municipality and the local or regional grid company figure it out. Like maybe you can get something to the local hydrogen cluster, or you can so you can sort of, it's a flexible system that allows for both variants. Thank you, Jeppe. Yeah, so I have a question here in the chat. Can you touch upon the process, including timeline for the designation of offshore wind areas applicable under the new auction framework? Yes, of course. So as I said when I showed the timeline, is that we don't think that it will be swift in Sweden to have this new system in place, have a new, it's not a new authority, but have an authority develop its competence and then start designating areas. So our assessment is that you can see the first auction in late 2026 or early 2027. Then how fast you will be able to see new areas being designated and tendered, that's an open question. I mean, there is one scenario where the government gives 5 million euros per year to the authority and says, we want the 10 gigawatts per year being designated, just do this, get this done, it's super important. And then you could see a quite intense or accelerated designation and tendering. And there's also another scenario which is perhaps more probable, is that it will be slower and be more like 1 or 2 or maybe 3 areas per year under the coming years after that. I think that the most important question here is whether the projects will be finalized. So there is one scenario where we managed now through this planning by permitting mindset to get like a good amount of ongoing projects permitted. They somehow are able to finalize their development. We get them connected to the grid. I mean, we sort of manage under the current framework. And then it's not necessarily necessary to have tenders in quite some time. I mean, we could see like 20 gigawatts being actually deployed under the next 10 years, perhaps, from the ongoing projects. That's a possibility. So the timeline for the system is very much dependent on like the priorities of the government and the energy policy, and B, to what extent the ongoing projects is being developed or finalized in the end. Thank you. So someone had their hand up, but then they took it down. No, Paul, please.
Yes, hello, Paul from EnBW in Germany. I was wondering, you said that this is like planning by permitting. I'm just wondering whether will there be any transparency about this? Because I think from like a development perspective, I feel like the government's decision to block all the permits due to military reasons seemed a little bit intransparent, and it's very important to keep the transparency up. And if you say, well, the government will pick the project it likes, like how is it possible from the outside to decide, okay, well, like to see how are they picking the projects? Do you think there will be some?
No, it's not a very transparent process. And to be frank, and as you haven't been in my process, but the Inquiry Commission has had a very frank, and I mean, and this is because the current framework is not a transparent framework. So it's not that our process is untransparent or the planning by permitting aspect. It's the current the current framework isn't a transparent framework. It allows for a very discretionary decision making from the government side, especially when we are in the economic exclusive zone, but also in the territorial waters. So basically, I would say that the non-transparency is actually a key that we can do this. If there would have been much higher requirements from the law that the government must apply this and this criteria and it must be like this and this formally, then we could probably not manage to get out of this using the ongoing projects. We would have to do like a Finnish or a German transition where we just canceled all the projects. But this smorgasbord approach or semi-transparent possibility is what saves us and being able us to work with the ongoing projects, in my opinion. I'm putting a bit edgy here, perhaps, but this is it's not a very transparent process. But it's also important to say that the government cannot be discriminatory, and it has to have like valid reasons, objective reasons for it. But I mean, you can still have a discretionary approach to the permitting.
Thank you.
Elon?
Hi, thanks, Matthias. So,
who are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Who are you?
Sorry, Alon Carmel. I'm a partner at PA Consulting, and I lead the offshore wind team here. So we did as you mentioned earlier, we did a peer review of this WECO report for you, looking at the investability of offshore wind in Sweden. I wanted to say that I'm very glad to see this work, and it's great initiative by the Swedish government and by you guys in the Commission to try and improve the Swedish system, because we advise investors and energy companies globally on new market strategy and so on, and we've unfortunately had to advise people not to look further at offshore wind in Sweden over the last couple of years, because the business case just doesn't stack up. And as you alluded to before, the revenues that can be earned from the Swedish power market in the absence of a CFD regime or any other state support are not sufficient to justify the capex investment for building offshore wind. I'm hoping that what you've done with your commission is moving the debate onwards in Sweden to start to look at how to improve the investability of offshore wind in Sweden. But I suspect that there would still be a need for either a CFD support mechanism or support through capex for the transmission asset. And so my question is, I'm aware that the Swedish government, through a separate commission, have announced that they're looking at CFDs for new nuclear, but there has been no suggestion from the Swedish government so far that anybody has been given the task of looking at whether they should be introducing CFDs for offshore wind or any other form of renewables. Is that correct, or is there some part of the government, whether within departments or through a special commission that you're aware of, that has been tasked to look at that question?
No, on the contrary. I mean, the previous government had a scheme where they had given the Swedish TSO the assignment to provide offshore grid connections. Now, this was a very problematic, I think, technical setup that they went for, and it was almost like how do you say återvändsgränd, like
dead end street.
A dead end at the end, because it was not from like a state aid and also technical approach. It in a Swedish setting, it was very problematic, but still it was like the policy of the country. A part of the government agenda, like the program when they went into office, was to withdraw this program. So on the contrary, I would say that the stated government policy at that point, at least, was to not provide subsidies or similar measures for offshore wind. Now, I think when you look at the government's like programs or like policy statements, they are still they very much welcome offshore wind, and they consider it an important part of the Swedish energy mix up until around 2030, like before you get the nuclear, which is the main focus of the Swedish government. It's considered, especially in the south of Sweden, where it's hard to get onshore wind deployed. But there has not been any discussions about replacing the offshore grid subsidies or whatever that was with some new program. And we also have no subsidies or similar since 15 years for onshore wind, and we've seen a lot of investments there. So perhaps you have an assumption up until now, at least, that it will be the same for offshore wind. But our inquiry commission shows that at least for most of the sea, that is not going to happen under current market conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question here in the chat. Do you have a sense of how the new system might work in terms of promoting the possibility of hybrid projects that combine interconnection with offshore wind projects? If this is a policy ambition in Sweden. So whoever posed this question, I'm not sure actually, do you mean like interconnectivity to other countries or to other parks? Or I think I need a clarification on that question actually to answer it. But I'll have a go at the second one. Have similar assessments been carried out for other technologies, nuclear, to allow comparison on cost investability? No, I was actually on the research side and also at some point on the governmental agency, there's been some work done, but there has not been like a technology neutral basic assessment for the energy policy, discussing how to develop a technology neutral or technology allocated energy production mix. Okay, so Tom, I saw that you showed up. Maybe you want to develop on your question.
Hi, Matthias. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I added the clarification into the chat, but thanks very much for a very informative presentation. It's really helpful. I suppose my question about hybrid projects was about thinking about interconnection between different countries.
Right.
So that, yeah, that was the context I was asking.
Yeah. So the new system is neutral here. So you can have a designated area where you would add like a condition that you are allowed to export the electrons or hydrogen. If you have an offshore hydrogen plant, for example, you would be allowed to export it directly through a pipeline or an interconnector to another country. Or you could have conditions in the concession saying that you are not allowed to do that. Like this has to come to Sweden, or you can even say to the grid at this point. So the system as such does not make any decisions in this regard.
Great, thank you for clarifying.
Thanks. All right, so perhaps there are no more questions. Very well, that will be a very, oh, here, Carmen, please.
Hello, good afternoon. So it's Carmen Tuazola from Iberdrola. Okay, so
Are you
I
calling
would have
from
a question. Yes, okay. From Bilbao in the north. Yes. So I would like to understand. So now that this has been delivered, these your conclusions, what you think is best going forward. I understand that as a report from that you have collected all information and assessment from everywhere. This is something that now the government will have to take into consideration and make their own conclusions and take their own decisions. So I understand that this is not like what is stated in your report is not mandatory, is not compulsory to be followed. It's just your best assessment of the current situation, what you think is best, and your proposal on how this should be taken going forward. So we should expect some conclusions at government level for developers and manufacturers to see what is going to happen going forward in Sweden, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so thank you, Carmen. I should have clarified that actually, I realize in the beginning. So this is only our report, and the next step is that it will be sent out for opinions, and here the authorities, but also all of the, even you could submit a response to the government, and then the government will assess both our report and the remittal responses, and then they will have to come back with a proposal to the government, to the parliament.
Okay, so this is still a live process, not only at government level, but everybody could make comments to this report. Is there a specific window for all these comments?
So they will, the government will send out a remittal, a request for responses, and that will be done early next year. I heard just now from the government office, and then it's usually like, I don't know, it's 2 months, something like that, that you have to reply.
Many thanks.
Thanks, Carmen. So please, Jeppe. Jeppe Lundbäck from Denmark. We can't hear you. I'm not. Maybe you are talking, but you are muted. Okay, so while Jeppe figures his technology out, I will pick up a question from the chat. Could you elaborate a bit on how you made sure to incorporate cumulative effects into the planning process? Well, basically, what we have assessed is that the current system has a very hard time in assessing cumulative effects because we are in a strict permitting regime. As I mentioned, the maritime spatial plans are only indicative, and they have a lot of reservations regarding like defense interests that have not been able to be assessed in the planning. So it's not a very useful, or that's maybe the wrong word, but it's not. Since it's not binding and it's hard to use the maritime spatial plan to assess the cumulative effects, as you don't know if an area will be developed in the end. It's more like a area nomination, like these areas seem to be reasonably good, but the plans do not expect all of the areas to be developed. And this means that the cumulative effect assessment is being done as part of the permitting. And this means that it's quite hard to make a cumulative assessment when you are technically just assessing or permitting one park at a time. Now, of course, the government is able to make like a joint assessment of several projects. For example, they denied 13 projects with one decision in November in the Baltic Sea due to defense concerns. That's an example of where they made a joint assessment. And at the same time, they gave a permit on the West Coast. But technically, it's like you assess one project. Now, in our proposed system, you will have this designation step where the government designates areas. And here you can work much more structured with the designation process. Like, for example, you could say that in this decision, we have now made 3 designated areas in the Baltic Sea, or maybe that's a bad example since we have the problems there, but in the North Sea. Do we even have a North Sea coast? On the West Coast. We have made these 3 designations, bum, bum, bum. The rest are for now blocked from offshore wind. So here, the fisheries can just prevail. And that kind of planning is allowed through this designation step, which is, please, if the question maker wants some additional questions, feel free, but that's hopefully a sufficient answer for you. And now Tuuli, and then Tuuli first.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So I'm Tuuli Oikanen from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment of Finland, the same place where Outi works, who talked earlier. So now that we have a little bit of time, I would be interested of the area selection. So if you could elaborate a little bit more of the process. If I understood it right, it would start from the area selection and the maritime spatial plan would be only indicative. So how would this process start and go on, and how the areas would be selected? Thank you.
Well, we don't really have an answer to that, because that will be part of the relevant authorities assessment. But I would, now I'm sort of trying to answer your question from myself. This is not in the report. It's more like what I'm thinking will happen here. Is that first and foremost, the first question is like, what ongoing projects are being finalized, right? That's a super important starting point. Are we seeing nothing being developed from the ongoing projects, or are we seeing, wow, we're seeing 20 or 30 gigawatts around Sweden being developed? Then that really decides where you need, when and where you need to start using the tender-based system. But let's say that you realize you need to use it, right? Then I think that the first step would be to look at the electricity demand, right? Where in Sweden do you need offshore wind in the energy mix? And you would probably find that southern Sweden is the most important part, because there we have the highest electricity prices. We have the least onshore wind. We don't have hydro down there. So that would probably be the most relevant place to start. I know that we have a lot of projects up north as well, but considering the objective preconditions, you would probably look there primarily. But I mean, the future is long, and technology prices could go down, and whatever. And then you would look at like opposing interests, like defense, fishery, etc. And you would look at the maritime spatial plans, and you would look very much at the grid development, and from there assess where to start. But this will be done. This will be led by the tendering authority, which will be one of the present authorities. We haven't decided which, in collaboration with the other authorities, and ultimately decided by the government. Okay, so now Jeppe has clarified his you mentioned that government is mostly considering nuclear power. Would nuclear power not need subsidies? And is the comparison of subsidies offshore wind versus nuclear? Sorry, I'm going to read it better. Would nuclear power not need subsidies? And is the comparison of subsidies offshore wind power versus nuclear not considered? It has been clarified over the last couple of years that that nuclear will need some kind of subsidy scheme. And the remittal window has just been closed for a suggestion to provide a combination of subsidies or financial support schemes, including contracts for difference, governmental loans, and I think something else as well for nuclear. And there has not been a similar process for offshore wind or some kind of governmental initiated comparison. It's a strictly nuclear subsidy scheme or financial support scheme that's being developed or assessed at this time in Sweden. Okay, so Roland, please.
Yes, thank you. Roland Mangs from Finnish Energy Agency. So I'm going to continue with this line with Tuuli and Outi. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. So my question is that you're going to, if I understood correctly, you're going to have two sets of projects. You're going to have the old projects, which potentially have this problem of you don't going to know when they're going to be completed, if ever. But my question is that the new projects, well, we heard about this issue of lack of missing money, but nonetheless, forgetting that for a moment. So what's your recommendation for the Swedish government on making sure that these projects are incentivized properly?
So we don't have any recommendations on that, and that's actually because the whole incentivization question is outside of our scope. It's very clear that we only address the planning and permitting systems. What we have done is two things. One is that we have assessed that under current market conditions, a strictly merchant or non-subsidized scheme will not lead to any major, at least, development. There might be a few areas in the very south potentially, but our assessment, or at least Sweco's assessment, is that there are now no areas that could be developed under current market conditions. So we've made that assessment, but and we've also shown how this is solved in other countries, like you have the CFD scheme in the UK, and you have the CFD scheme that was previously deployed in Denmark, and you have the Dutch and the German grid connection scheme. So we have explained these different alternatives, but that's as far as we can come in our commission, because we don't have the or subsidy question at all in our or actually even that we don't have that in our directives.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and it was requested that I post a link to the report in the chat. I will do that now immediately. And as I said, you will find the English summary on page 25. Here is the link to the report. Another question, did the inquiry consider the option of offshore wind areas being formally designated under maritime spatial plans as an alternative to indicative areas? It would seem that this would allow for a more integrated approach, facilitate community impact assessment through the strategic environmental assessment, and be more consistent with the MSP and Maritime Spatial Plan and Maritime Spatial F. I'm not sure what the F means, directives. Yes, we did consider this as an option. The reason why we didn't opt for that is that it would require us to reinvent the Swedish implementation of the Maritime Spatial Plan Directive. So Sweden has chosen to implement it like some other countries in an indicative plan only. And we considered that not like starting to mess around with the implementation of that directive was a more appropriate way to solve our problem with the offshore wind, because that would be, it would mean that you would have to consider if all the other usages or indications in the Maritime Spatial Plan, is that also going to be binding, like sea and fishery and maritime, like natural, and that would mean that we would have to go into a much more complex and a bigger question on what role the Maritime Spatial Plan has in Sweden, and we found that to be a more complex way of approaching this task. Right. A follow-up question on the problem of missing money. Is it mainly a supply side topic? Is it mainly a supply side issue or demand side issue, in my opinion? So I don't have an opinion on that. So is it CAPEX or is it like, I don't have an opinion on that. What could be said though is, if you delve into Sweden's energy system for a second, so in a sense we're sort of suffering that Sweden was doing too well like 50 or 40 years ago. So we developed I think it's one of Europe's best grid, most efficient and stable grids. We have built a lot of hydropower in the north, and we have nuclear power from the 70s and the 80s. And all of this has now been completely deprivated. Is that the right word? Its marginal cost is very low, and this means that we have Europe's lowest energy prices, especially in the north. Of course, with these low prices, it's very hard to sell PPAs at the kind of levels that you would need to facilitate anything else than onshore wind at this point. And even I think that even some onshore wind projects are actually struggling at this time because of this dynamic where new production has a much higher levelized cost than the old production that is just going on and on year after year. So in a sense, like many other parts of Europe, and also all of our electricity more or less is already fossil free because we have the mix that I just explained. So while the rest of Europe has higher prices already and has carbon fossil emissions from their power grid, and it's part of the ETS, there's a much more, and has been for several years or even decades now, like a transitionary push that we haven't had in Sweden. And now the reason that we're looking at it now is because not that we need to actually transition our electricity production, but rather that we need to expand it to allow for the industry to be being electrified. So that's sort of like the Swedish, what do you say? What Swedish seat, or what were our preconditions at this time. Okay. So it seems we are not receiving any more questions. Any? Okay, so I will then conclude the meeting. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, and especially all of those who have met us when we traveled Europe. And great thanks to all of you for helping us understand the European country context. It was been very important for our work. Yep. So that ends the webinar.